Most people think of consciousness like a light switch because that is how experience appears at the surface. You are either awake or asleep, aware or unaware, present or gone. The mind simplifies what it cannot track continuously, so it compresses a gradient into a decision. That compression feels clean, but it quietly removes everything that exists between the extremes. And what gets removed is where the real structure actually lives. If consciousness were truly a switch, there would be a clear moment where it fully disappears and then fully returns. But when you look closer, that moment is never as clean as it first seems. There are traces, fragments, and residual signals that do not fit into a simple on or off state. Awareness does not vanish cleanly. It thins, distorts, shifts, and redistributes. That alone suggests something is being simplified after the fact rather than observed directly. You can see this in how memory behaves. People often assume that if they cannot remember something, then consciousness was not present. But memory is not the same as awareness. It is only what the system was able to store and retrieve later. There are entire experiences that happen without being recorded in a way the mind can access. That creates the illusion of absence, when in reality it may only be a failure of translation. Once you notice that, the idea of a binary state begins to weaken, because now you have to account for awareness that existed but was not captured, processed, or expressed. That means the system can be active without producing a clear output. And if that is true, then what you call unconscious might simply be a state where the output channel is restricted rather than the awareness itself being gone. This changes how you interpret moments where consciousness seems to drop out. Instead of asking whether awareness was present, you begin asking what level of awareness was accessible. That is a very different question because it shifts the focus from existence to degree. It assumes continuity first and then looks for variation within that continuity. That is the beginning of seeing the gradient instead of the switch. The mechanism behind this is not abstract, it is functional. The brain does not operate as a single unified switch. It operates as a network with varying levels of integration. Different regions come online and go offline, synchronize and desynchronize, depending on the state of the system. What you experience as consciousness is tied to how integrated those processes are at any given moment. When integration drops, experience changes, but it does not necessarily disappear. This is why certain states feel dim rather than absent. You can be aware in a fragmented way, where perception exists but coherence does not. Thoughts may not form clearly, but something is still registering. Sensations may occur without a sense of identity attached to them. These are not off states. They are low integration states that still belong to the same continuum. From a different angle, consider how attention moves. You do not become conscious only when you focus. You are already conscious, and attention selects what becomes clear. When attention narrows, parts of your experience fall out of focus, but they do not cease to exist. They remain in the background, influencing perception without being directly noticed. That means even within a single moment, consciousness is already layered. So what you call being fully conscious is really a state where attention, memory, and perception are aligned enough to create a stable experience. When that alignment breaks, the experience changes, but the underlying activity continues. This is why transitions feel gradual when you pay attention to them. Falling asleep, waking up, drifting, zoning out, none of these happen instantly. They move across a range. If you observe yourself closely, you can catch these transitions in real time. There are moments where you are not fully engaged, but not fully gone either. You hear something without processing it, or you respond before thinking clearly. There is awareness there, but it is not organized in the way you expect. That is the continuum showing itself without the mind forcing it into a category. The perspective shift here is subtle but important. Instead of asking whether consciousness is present, you begin asking how it is present. That opens up a different kind of observation, one that looks for variation instead of confirmation. You stop trying to label the state and start noticing how it behaves. And the more you do that, the harder it becomes to maintain a binary view. This also changes how you interpret other people. Someone who appears unresponsive might still be experiencing something internally. The absence of visible reaction does not guarantee the absence of awareness. It may only indicate that the expression layer is not functioning in a way you recognize. That introduces a level of uncertainty that the binary model tries to eliminate. The implication of this is not just philosophical, it affects how you relate to experience itself. If consciousness is a continuum, then there are levels of awareness you move through without recognizing them. You may assume you were not present in certain moments, when in reality you were present in a way that did not leave a clear trace. That means your sense of presence is narrower than your actual range of awareness. Once you see that, you begin to question how much of your life has been filtered out by the way you interpret it. Moments you dismissed as blank may not have been empty at all. They may have been states where awareness was not structured in a familiar way. And if that is true, then your understanding of your own experience is already incomplete. This does not mean everything is always fully conscious. It means the boundary is not where you thought it was. The edges are softer, more flexible, and more dependent on how the system is functioning. What looks like a clear line from a distance becomes a gradient when examined closely. And that gradient does not collapse just because the mind prefers simplicity. At this point, the idea of a switch starts to feel less like a reality and more like a convenience. It is a way to organize experience quickly, not a description of how it actually works. It helps with decision making, but it hides the underlying structure. Once you begin to see that structure, it becomes difficult to go back to a simplified view without noticing what it is missing. Because now the question is no longer whether consciousness turns on or off. The question becomes how many states exist between what you call on and what you call off. And more importantly, how many of those states you have already passed through without ever realizing they were there. The continuum becomes easier to understand when you stop looking for consciousness only at its brightest point. Most people define awareness by the version of themselves that can speak clearly, remember events, make choices, and explain what happened afterward. That version is real, but it is not the whole range. It is only the most organized expression of consciousness, the part that leaves the cleanest evidence behind. When that organized expression weakens, the mind assumes awareness is gone because it does not know how to recognize quieter forms. You can notice this in ordinary life before you ever need a medical example. There are moments when you are present but not fully gathered. You may stare at a wall while your body is tired, and someone asks if you are listening. You realize you heard them without truly receiving them. You were not absent, but you were not fully available either. That middle condition is important because it shows that consciousness already moves by degree, even in daily experience. The mechanism is simple enough to see once it is named. Awareness depends on many layers working together: attention, memory, perception, emotion, body regulation, and the ability to respond. When those layers align, you feel clear and fully here. When they fall out of alignment, consciousness does not simply disappear, it changes shape. Some layers stay active while others fade into the background. This is why the old switch model fails so quietly. It takes one visible layer, usually response, and treats it as the whole condition. If the person can answer, they are conscious. If they cannot answer, they are not. But answering is not consciousness itself. It is consciousness passing through enough working systems to become visible. When the path to visibility breaks, presence may still remain in a form we cannot easily confirm. This changes the way you look at sleep, anesthesia, coma, meditation, shock, and even emotional overwhelm. These are not all the same state, but they reveal the same principle. Consciousness can narrow, dim, fragment, deepen, or lose its ability to report itself. What differs is not only whether awareness is present, but how organized, accessible, and expressive it is. The continuum gives you language for that range without forcing every state into yes or no. Once you see consciousness this way, the previous questions in the series begin to connect more naturally. Perception may come before thought, but perception itself can vary in depth and clarity. Unity may remain even when integration weakens, but that unity can become thinner or less coordinated. Awareness may exist without expression, but expression tells us something about how much of the system is available. Anesthesia may not prove total disappearance, but it does show how easily ordinary access can be interrupted. That is what a continuum allows you to hold. It does not force one extreme against another. It lets you say that a person may be aware, but not fully able to integrate that awareness. It lets you say that someone may perceive, but not remember. It lets you say that a person may receive the world, but not be able to answer it. That kind of language is more careful, and carefulness matters when consciousness is the subject. The experience of waking up shows this in a familiar way. You do not usually return from sleep as a complete self in one instance. First there is sensation, then orientation, then memory, then identity, then purpose. For a few seconds, you may not know the day, the place, or what you were supposed to do, yet something is already present before the full self comes online. That something is not nothing. It is consciousness before full organization. The same pattern appears when you are falling asleep. Thoughts begin to loosen. Images appear without command. Sounds drift in and out. Your sense of body changes. And identity starts to soften before awareness fully releases its grip on the waking world. If consciousness were only a switch, these borderlands would not matter. But they matter because they are where the gradient becomes visible. The implication is that consciousness is not one thing happening at one volume. It is more like a living field with levels of coherence. At higher coherence, you can reflect, choose, remember, and speak. At lower coherence, you may still sense, feel, react, or register without forming a complete story. The difference is not meaningless. It tells us what kind of consciousness is present, not simply whether consciousness exists. This also helps prevent a mistake on the other side. Saying consciousness is a continuum does not mean every state is equally conscious. It does not mean a rock, a sleeping person, a dreaming person, and an awake person are all the same. A continuum is not a flattening. It is a way to make distinctions more precise rather than less precise. It replaces crude categories with better attention. That matters because many people hear continuum and think it means everything blends into everything else. But a continuum can still have thresholds, shifts, and meaningful differences. Dawn is not the same as noon, even though light increases gradually. A whisper is not the same as a shout, even though both belong to sound. In the same way, dim awareness is not the same as full waking consciousness, but both may belong to the broader range of conscious life. This perspective also changes how you relate to yourself. You may stop judging your low energy states as failure or absence. You may begin to notice when you are present in a reduced way and treat that state with more honesty. Sometimes you are not ready to make decisions because your consciousness is narrowed by stress, fatigue, grief, or fear. That does not make you broken. It means your system is operating at a different level of coherence. When you understand this, self-awareness becomes less about forcing clarity and more about recognizing state. You start asking, how much of me is actually online right now? How available is my attention? How stable is my perception? How much am I reacting from a narrowed state rather than responding from a wider one? These questions are practical because they help you stop treating every version of yourself as equally clear. The same applies to others. Someone may speak sharply because their awareness is narrowed by pain. Someone may seem distant because their system is conserving energy. Someone may not respond because their inner field is overloaded. This does not excuse every action, but it changes how you interpret behavior. You begin seeing people not as fixed personalities, but as beings moving through states of greater or lesser coherence. That shift is compassionate without becoming naive. It does not remove responsibility, but it adds context. The person still has to answer for harm, yet you can understand that harm often comes from narrow consciousness rather than deliberate evil. When awareness contracts, people lose access to perspective, patience, and subtlety. When awareness widens, those capacities often return. That is not an excuse, it is a map. The continuum also gives the spiritual path a more grounded language. Growth is not always a leap into a higher state. Sometimes it is the slow widening of what you can stay conscious inside of. You become able to remain present during discomfort, uncertainty, conflict, or grief without collapsing into automatic reaction. That is not dramatic, but it is profound. It means consciousness is gaining range. This is where the teaching begins to turn from theory into practice. If consciousness exists by degree, then every moment becomes an opportunity to notice the degree you are living from. Are you present only enough to function, or present enough to feel? Are you aware only of your own reaction, or aware of the whole situation? Are you seeing through fear, or seeing fear as part of a wider field? These are not abstract questions, they are the daily mechanics of awakening. And once you begin seeing consciousness as a continuum, you stop asking only whether someone is awake. You begin asking what kind of awake they are. You begin noticing the difference between alertness and depth, between reaction and presence, between memory and awareness, between expression and being. That is where the next layer opens, because the continuum does not only describe damaged states or altered states, it describes the hidden range of ordinary human life. Once consciousness is understood as a continuum, the question of awareness becomes more human. It stops being a distant theory about brains, machines, hospitals, and altered states, and it returns to the way you actually move through life. You begin to see that you are not equally awake in every moment you call waking. You are always somewhere within a range, and that range changes with stress, attention, breath, emotion, safety, exhaustion, and meaning. The self you call normal is only one arrangement inside a much wider field. This is why the switch model is so misleading. It makes you think the only important question is whether consciousness is present or absent. But the deeper question is how wide consciousness is allowed to become. A person can be awake enough to function and still not be awake enough to truly see. A person can answer questions, complete tasks, and carry responsibilities while moving through life in a narrowed state of awareness. You may have lived entire seasons this way. You were awake, but survival was doing most of the seeing. You handled work, answered messages, paid bills, spoke to people, and kept moving, yet something in you was not fully available. Later, when more space returned, you looked back and realized you had been present only in the smallest way necessary. That was still consciousness, but it was contracted consciousness. This matters because many people judge themselves harshly for who they become while narrowed. They look at old reactions and say, that was me. But it may be more accurate to say, that was me operating from a reduced field. That does not erase responsibility, but it adds truth. A narrowed state does not reveal your full being. It reveals what your system could access under pressure. The mechanism is easy to overlook because it feels personal. When fear rises, attention tightens. When grief rises, energy withdraws. When shame rises, perception bends inward and begins scanning for threat. The world does not disappear, but it shrinks. You still see, think, and respond, but you are doing it through a smaller aperture. This is why healing often feels like seeing what was already there. Nothing outside may change at first, but your field of awareness widens. You notice context you could not notice before. You hear tones you would have missed. You recognize your own reactions without becoming fully captured by them. The world feels different because your degree of consciousness has changed. From this view, awakening is not an escape from ordinary life. It is the gradual expansion of what can be included in awareness without collapse. You become able to feel discomfort without immediately running from it. You become able to hold another person's perspective without abandoning your own. You become able to witness fear without letting fear become the only voice in the room. This is consciousness increasing its range. That range is not measured only by intensity. Some people mistake intensity for depth, because intense states feel spiritual, emotional, or dramatic. But a wider consciousness is often quieter than that. It does not always announce itself with visions, breakthroughs, or overwhelming emotion. Sometimes it appears as patience, steadiness, restraint, and the ability to remain honest without becoming cruel. This is where the continuum becomes practical. You can begin asking what expands awareness and what narrows it. Certain environments make consciousness smaller because they demand defense. Certain relationships make consciousness smaller because you must constantly manage yourself. Certain habits make consciousness smaller because they dull perception or trap attention in loops. Other environments, relationships, and practices widen consciousness because they let the system settle enough to perceive more accurately. You can feel this in your body before you can explain it. Around some people, your awareness becomes spacious. You hear yourself more clearly, breathe more naturally, and respond with more choice. Around others, your awareness collapses into performance, protection, or anticipation. That does not mean every discomfort is wrong, but it does mean your state is giving you information. Consciousness as a continuum teaches you to respect that information instead of overriding it. The same principle applies to society. A culture can train people into narrow awareness by keeping them overstimulated, afraid, exhausted, and constantly evaluated. When people are trapped in survival attention, they become easier to predict and easier to control. They lose access to subtlety, patience, and long-range thinking. A society built on narrow consciousness will call itself realistic, while quietly losing its ability to perceive reality. This is why the continuum is not only personal, it is collective. The level of consciousness available in a room changes what can happen in that room. A family in a narrowed state repeats patterns. A community in a narrowed state needs enemies. A nation in a narrowed state mistakes reaction for truth. When awareness widens, new possibilities appear because people can perceive more than threat, habit, and immediate self-protection. This also explains why binary thinking is so common during conflict. When consciousness narrows, the mind wants simple divisions: good or bad, right or wrong, with me or against me, awake or asleep, conscious or unconscious. The switch model is attractive because narrowed awareness prefers clean categories. A wider field can tolerate gradients without losing clarity. That is an important distinction. Seeing consciousness as a continuum does not mean losing discernment. It means gaining better discernment. You can recognize that someone is present but not fully available. You can recognize that you are aware but not deeply clear. You can recognize that a state has value without pretending it is the highest state. The continuum gives you more precision, not less. This returns to the earlier scientific questions with a wider lens. Anesthesia, covert awareness, split brain research, and altered states all reveal that consciousness cannot be reduced to one visible sign. The same lesson appears inside ordinary life. You are more than your response, more than your memory, more than your speech, more than your most organized state. The field is broader than its brightest expression. The implication is that care must become more intelligent. You do not treat every state as equal, but you also do not dismiss a state because it is quiet, fragmented, or hard to measure. You learn to listen differently. You learn to watch for degrees of presence. You learn to speak with more humility around silence, confusion, exhaustion, and altered awareness. You stop assuming that what cannot explain itself has nothing to say. And eventually, this changes the way you practice your own life. You stop asking only, am I conscious? You begin asking, how conscious am I in this moment? And what will widen the field? Sometimes the answer is rest. Sometimes it is truth. Sometimes it is breath, grief, solitude, forgiveness, or the courage to stop lying to yourself. Consciousness expands when the system no longer has to spend all its energy defending a false arrangement. That is why graduality matters. A switch gives you no path. A continuum gives you movement. It shows that awareness can deepen, widen, stabilize, refine, and return. It shows that you are not trapped between asleep and awake, but always traveling through degrees of presence. And once you understand that, the real question becomes not whether consciousness is on, but what kind of consciousness you are becoming capable of carrying.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.